The agreement had been 3 men, 1 winter, 1 cabin. The agreement dissolved on the 1st day of November, 1857. When 2 of the 3 men decided the cabin was adequate for 2 and insufficient for 3, and the 3rd man found his belongings outside the door in the morning before he had finished his coffee. The 3rd man was Joseph Brower. He picked up his belongings and walked to the storage shed at the east end of the claim and stood in it and thought about what he had, which was his stonemason's tools, $40 in a leather purse, a bedroll, and the knowledge that a man without shelter in central Illinois, in November, had approximately 6 weeks before the cold became serious and the serious cold killed him or forced him to leave the land he had filed for. He did not intend to leave the land. The shed was 12 by 16 feet, built from rough-sawn boards on a plank floor with no foundation. A single window on the south wall covered with oilcloth, and no heating device of any kind. He had built it himself in the summer as a materials store for the stonemason work he had been doing on neighboring claims, and it was full of his materials, which were field stone from the creek bed, and clay and sand and the lime he had purchased in Springfield for mortar work. The materials were on the claim because the claim had a good fieldstone supply and because he had been using it as a base of operations. The materials were also, as he stood in the shed on the morning of November 1st, exactly what he needed to build what he had been thinking about building for 14 years. His name was Joseph Brower. He was 41 years old, born in Bavaria. Trained as a stonemason under a master named Conrad Schreiber in the town of Straubing from the age of 16 to the age of 23, and he had learned from Schreiber not only how to cut and lay stone, but how stone behaved when heat moved through it, which was the knowledge that distinguished a stonemason who built good fireplaces from a stonemason who built exceptional ones. What Schreiber had taught him in the winter of 1843, when the workshop had been cold and they had been building a new heating stove for the Guildhall, was the contraflow principle. The conventional fireplace and the conventional chimney worked the same way they had always worked, which was that you built a fire, the fire heated the room, and the fire heated the air, and the heated air rose up the chimney and left the building, taking with it most of the heat the fire had produced. A conventional fireplace, Schreiber had said with the specific contempt of a craftsman describing inadequate work, was a machine for sending heat up a chimney. It heated the chimney excellently. It heated the room as a side effect. The contraflow stove did the opposite. In a contraflow stove, the combustion gases did not rise directly up and out. They rose first into the upper firebox, then descended through a second channel running beside the first, releasing their remaining heat into the surrounding masonry as they descended, and exited at the bottom of the second channel near floor level, where the gases were cool enough that they had given most of their heat to the stone. The stone absorbed the heat. The stone released the heat slowly over hours, long after the fire had gone out. This was the principle Schreiber had explained in 1843, and Joseph had helped build the Guildhall stove to this principle, and he had understood it completely in the way that a 27-year-old stonemason understands a principle his master demonstrates with actual stone and mortar and fire. He had understood it in his hands as well as his head, which was the understanding that mattered for building. He had come to Illinois in 1854 and had been doing stonemason work on other men's claims for 3 years and had filed his own claim in 1856 and had entered the 3-man winter arrangement in October of 1857 because 3 men sharing a cabin through in Illinois. Winter was a practical response to the fuel and heating situation, and the dissolution of that arrangement on November 1st was a problem he had not planned for. He stood in the shed with his materials and his tools, and 14 years of the contraflow principle in his hands, and he made the decision that he had been waiting for a situation to require it. He would build the contraflow stove in the shed. He had the stone. He had the clay and sand and lime for the mortar. He had the tools. He had built 6 conventional fireplaces on neighboring claims in the previous 3 years, and he had the specific physical knowledge of how fieldstone from the creek bed behaved under heat, which was well. The stone being a dense limestone with good thermal mass and no tendency to spall under the temperature cycles of a working stove. He needed 4 days to build it, which was not a metaphor, but a specific consequence of the contraflow principle. The masonry mass absorbed the heat from a single large piece of wood burning completely, and the mass released that heat over 6 to 8 hours. And 6 to 8 hours of warmth from one piece of wood was a different proposition than the 2 hours of warmth from one piece of wood that a conventional fireplace delivered before the fire died and the heat went up the chimney. He began on November 2nd. The foundation was the first task, which in a shed with no foundation meant building one. He dug a hole in the plank floor 60 inches by 36 inches and 18 inches deep, filled it with compacted creek gravel for drainage, and laid the first course of fieldstone on the gravel bed using the lime mortar he mixed in the ratio Schreiber had specified. 1 part lime, 2 parts sand, enough water to produce the consistency that held its shape when pressed between the fingers but was not stiff. The foundation course established the footprint of the stove, and 54 inches tall at the firebox top, which was larger than any stove he had built in Illinois, but appropriate to the contraflow requirement, which needed sufficient mass to absorb and hold the heat of a complete combustion cycle. The mass was the point. Conventional fireplace needed no mass because it was not storing heat, only passing it through. The contraflow stove needed mass because the mass was the mechanism. Stone absorbed heat. Stone released heat slowly. The rate of release was determined by the mass of the stone, and he had calculated that 60 by 36 by 54 inches of dense fieldstone would maintain the interior of the 12 by 16 shed at FET, adequate temperature for 6 to 8 hours after the fire went out, provided the shed walls were adequately sealed against cold infiltration. He spent one morning on the shed walls before beginning the stove, pressing each board joint with his palm and feeling where the cold air entered, which was at every joint because the rough-sawn boards had not been sealed. He mixed a small batch of clay and pressed it into every board joint he could reach from inside, working around the full perimeter, using his thumb and the flat edge of his trowel to press the clay firmly into the gaps. This took half a day and used perhaps 20 pounds of clay from his materials stock. The shed was measurably less drafty by evening. Then he built the stove. The firebox occupied the lower front section of the stove body, 20 inches wide, 18 inches deep, and 20 inches tall, opening at the front through a door he had fabricated from iron plate he had purchased in Springfield for a different project, and had not yet used. The door was hinged with iron straps. He bent himself from flat bar stock, and it sealed the firebox, opening against uncontrolled air infiltration when closed. Above the firebox, in the conventional stove, would be the flue opening leading upward to the chimney. In the contraflow stove, above the firebox, was the upper chamber, a space the same width and depth as the firebox, but taller, where the combustion gas is collected after rising from the firebox. The gases entered the upper chamber hot, at the peak temperature of the combustion. And from the upper chamber they could not go up. The top of the upper chamber was sealed stone. They could only go down through the narrow descending channels on both sides of the upper chamber that Schreiber had called the Gegenstrom, the countercurrent, the reversed flow. This was the reversal the title named. The smoke went down. Not because smoke naturally goes down, which it does not, but because the pressure differential between the hot upper chamber and the cooler, lower exit created a draft that pulled the gases downward through the descending channels. The same way a conventional chimney's temperature differential pulled gases upward. Hot air in the upper chamber, cooler air in the descending channels. The temperature gradient drove the flow. The descending channels were each 6 inches wide and ran the full height of the stove body from the upper chamber connection at the top to the exit manifold at the bottom, where the cooled gases collected and exited through a conventional flue pipe running horizontally through the shed wall at a height of 18 inches above the floor, low enough that any remaining heat in the exiting gases warmed the lower room air rather than escaping at ceiling height. He laid the stove courses over 4 days, each course requiring the careful placement of field stone cut and fitted to maintain the channel geometry throughout the full height. The descending channels had to be consistent in cross-section from top to bottom, because an inconsistent channel would create turbulence that disrupted the downward draft and allowed gases to back up into the firebox. He used his smallest chisels for the fitting work, cutting each stone to within a 1/4 inch of the required dimension, which was the tolerance Schreiber had specified as adequate for the mortar joint to manage. He worked by tallow candlelight in the evenings and in the cold shed mornings before the light improved, wearing his wool coat and hat and working the stone with the slow, deliberate pace of cold hands on precise work. He had worked in cold conditions before and knew that cold hands lost precision before they lost strength, and that the answer was to warm the hands frequently and work in shorter sessions, rather than pushing through until the hands became inaccurate. He warmed his hands on the still warm remnants of the previous day's mortar, mixed with hot water from the small fire he kept in a clay pot outside the shed door. This was not a comfortable arrangement. It was an adequate one. The stove was complete on November 5th. He let the mortar cure for 24 hours before lighting the first fire. As Schreiber had required for all lime mortar work, he built the first fire on November 6th. A small fire of dry oak from the woodpile he had accumulated over the summer. 3 pieces, each piece approximately 4 inches in diameter and 18 inches long. He lit the fire at 7 in the morning and closed the firebox door. He waited. At 9 in the morning, the stove exterior was warmed to the touch at the midpoint of the stove body, which was where the upper chamber connected to the descending channels. He pressed his palm to the stone at that point and felt the specific warmth of masonry that has absorbed heat through its full depth. Not the surface warmth of a hot stone, but the even warmth that came from the core out. The warmth that meant the heat was in the stone rather than on it. At 11 in the morning, 4 hours after lighting the fire, had consumed the 3 pieces of wood and gone out. He did not add more wood. He pressed the stove exterior at various points and felt the warmth throughout. He pressed the floor near the stove base and felt the warmth radiating from the masonry into the surrounding air. The shed was 58 degrees. At 3 in the afternoon, 8 hours after lighting, the shed was 51 degrees. The stove was still warm to the touch. The stone was releasing what it had absorbed in the first 4 hours. He wrote in the small account book he carried for materials accounting, November 6th. First fire. 3 pieces oak, 4-inch diameter. Fire at 7, out at 11. Shed temperature at 11, 58 degrees. At 3 in afternoon, 51 degrees. Stove still warm, no additional wood burned. He looked at the numbers for a while. He wrote below them, Schreiber was right. He had known Schreiber was right since 1843. He had the numbers for Illinois now. The 2 men in the main cabin burned wood continuously through that November. He could see the smoke from their chimney from the shed window. The heavy, continuous smoke of a conventional fireplace requiring constant tending to maintain the temperature of a poorly insulated space. He did not approach them. They did not approach him. The claim was large enough that their daily routines did not intersect unless both parties chose to intersect them. And neither party was choosing. He burned 3 to 4 pieces of dry oak per day through November. One morning firing, sufficient to bring the shed to 60 degrees by mid-morning and to maintain the masonry heat through the afternoon and into the early evening. If the night was very cold, he built a second small fire at 7 in the evening that brought the masonry back to full heat and kept the shed above 45 degrees through the night hours. 1 firing per day. 2 on the coldest nights. The conventional fireplace in the main cabin required wood every 2 to 3 hours around the clock to maintain adequate temperature. He was burning approximately 1/8 of what the main cabin was burning. The first of the 2 men came to the shed in December. His name was Heinrich Vogel, and he came not to apologize, but to look, which Joseph had expected. Vogel was a practical man who had made a calculation in November that had seemed correct at the time, and that the December fuel situation had caused him to reconsider. He stood in the shed doorway and felt the warmth. He looked at the stove, which was large and low and unlike any heating device he had seen in Illinois. He said, "What is that?" Joseph said, "A contraflow stove. Come in." Vogel came in. Joseph explained the principle, drawing the gas path on a piece of paper with a pencil stub, the arrow rising into the upper chamber and then reversing downward through the channels and exiting low at the wall. Vogel followed the drawing and asked 2 questions. The first was about the downward draft mechanism, which Joseph explained as the temperature differential between the hot upper chamber and the cooler descending channels. The second was about the exit flue position at 18 inches, which Joseph explained as a heat recovery position. The exiting gas is still warm enough at that height to contribute to the lower room temperature rather than being wasted at ceiling level. Vogel pressed the stove exterior. He pressed it in 3 places. He stood back and looked at the stove. He said, "How long did it take to build?" Joseph said, 4 days. Vogel said, "And 1 fire heats it through the day." Joseph said, 1 fire in the morning, a second in the evening on the coldest nights. I am burning 1/8 of what your chimney requires. Vogel was quiet. He said, "I should not have put you out in November." Joseph said, "No, you should not have." Vogel said, "I would like to build one in the main cabin." Joseph said, "Yes, I will build it for you in the spring when the mortar can cure in warmer conditions. I will charge you my standard rate." Vogel said, "Your standard rate." Joseph said, "I am a stonemason. This is stonemason work." "My standard rate applies?" Vogel nodded. He said, "Fair." He left. He came back the following week with the second man, whose name was Peter Skell, and who pressed the stove in more locations than Vogel had and asked more questions, and who said, at the end of the visit, "I have never been warm in Illinois in December. Not like this," Joseph said. The stone holds what the fire gives it. The fire gives more than you can feel from the fire itself. The stone gives it back slowly. Skell said. Why does no one build these? Joseph said. They do not know how. The knowledge is in Germany and Russia. I learned it in Bavaria. Skell said. Will you teach me? Joseph said. I will teach whoever pays my instruction rate, which is separate from my building rate. He was not charitable about the rates. He was fair about them, which was not the same thing, which they had requested because they wanted to build a second stove in the new section of the main cabin they were extending. By the winter of 1858, the 3 contraflow stoves were operating in the central Illinois Valley where Joseph had filed his claim. By the winter of 1869, he had built 6 of the 9 himself and had supervised the construction of the other 3 by builders who had received his formal instruction and who had built correctly enough that the stoves operated as designed. The formal instruction was a 2-day course he offered in the winters when construction work was slow. He taught the gas path first, drawing it on paper until the student could redraw it from memory without reference. He taught the channel geometry second, explaining the tolerance requirements and what happened to the draft when tolerances were exceeded. He taught the mortar specification third, and the curing requirement fourth, and the first fire procedure fifth. 5 parts. He had organized the instruction the way Schreiber had organized it for him in 1843, which was in the sequence that physical construction required. Each part building on the previous, because a stonemason who understood the sequence could troubleshoot problems that a stonemason who had only memorized the steps could not. He proved up his claim in 1860 and farmed the land for another 30 years alongside the stonemason work, which he never stopped doing because it was what he knew and what he was good at. And because the demand for contraflow stoves in central Illinois grew steadily through the 1860s and 1870s as the knowledge spread through the German immigrant networks and then beyond them into the English-speaking settler community when word of the fuel consumption differential became impossible to ignore. 1/8 of the wood. That was what the numbers said. 1/8 of the wood to maintain the same temperature through an Illinois winter. The word spread because the arithmetic was the kind of arithmetic that frontier farmers who were hauling and splitting and purchasing could calculate in their heads and could not ignore once they had calculated it. He died in 1891 at the age of 75. In the claim cabin he had extended twice since 1857, with 3 contraflow stoves in it, 1 in each of the 3 sections he had built. The original stove in the shed was still standing and still functional. He had used it as a workshop stove for 34 years, firing it every cold morning, pressing the stone at midpoint to confirm the heat was in the mass, adding a second fire on the coldest evenings. 34 years. The stone held. The smoke went down. The heat stayed. 1 piece of firewood at a time. The contraflow principle requires precise explanation because the title's promise, 1 firewood, sounds like exaggeration until the physics are clear. And the physics are clear only when you understand what happens to heat in a conventional fireplace versus what happens to it in a contraflow stove. In a conventional fireplace, the combustion process produces gases at temperatures between 800 and 1200 degrees Fahrenheit at the point of combustion. These gases rise immediately because hot gas is less dense than cool gas and buoyancy is the dominant force. The gases travel upward through the throat of the fireplace, into the smoke chamber, and up the chimney flue, exiting at the top of the chimney, a temperature still typically between 3 and 500 degrees. 3 to 500 degrees of heat exiting at the chimney top. That heat is gone. It has heated the flue, which is outside the living space. It has heated the chimney, which is largely outside or in the wall. It has not heated the room. A conventional fireplace with a properly drawing chimney in winter conditions delivers perhaps 15 to 20% of its combustion energy to the room. The other 80 to 85% exits at the chimney top. Not a metaphor, 85% of the firewood's energy gone. The contraflow stove captures the 85% by forcing the combustion gases to travel a longer path through the masonry before they can exit. The gases rise from the firebox into the upper chamber as buoyancy requires, because you cannot prevent hot gas from rising. But when the gases reach the sealed top of the upper chamber, they cannot continue upward. They are forced sideways into the top openings of the descending channels. This is where the reversal happens. The gases must go down. They do not naturally go down, but the draft created by the temperature differential between the hot upper chamber and the cooler exit manifold pulls them downward through the two descending channels. The same physics that makes chimneys draw hot air above, creating low pressure that pulls cooler air upward from below, works here in the reverse orientation. Hot gas in the upper chamber, cooler gas pathway below, the gradient pulling the flow downward. As the gases descend through the channels, they transfer heat to the surrounding stone. The stone is cooler than the gas, so the heat transfers from gas to stone through conduction at the channel wall surfaces. The gases cool as they descend. By the time they reach the exit manifold at the bottom of the channels, they are typically at 100 to 150 degrees rather than the 400 degrees at which they would have exited a conventional chimney. 100 to 150 degrees exiting instead of 400. The difference, 250 to 300 degrees worth of heat, has been transferred to the stone. The stone now holds that heat and will release it gradually over the next 6 to 8 hours through radiation and convection from the stove exterior surfaces. This is the mass. This is why the stove needed to be large. The amount of heat the stone could absorb and hold was proportional to its mass, and a stove with insufficient mass would absorb only part of the available heat and reach its thermal limit before the fire was complete, wasting the remainder. Joseph had calculated the mass required for the shed's volume based on Schreiber's specifications, adjusted for the Illinois climate he had observed over 3 years, and had arrived at the 60 by 36 by 54-inch footprint and height. The calculation was not precise in the way that an engineer's calculation would be precise. It was a craftsman's calculation, based on specific examples Schreiber had given him and on his own observation of how quickly the stone of similar mass heated and cooled in the stoves he had built in Bavaria. He had built 4 contraflow stoves under Schreiber's supervision before coming to America. He knew from physical experience what adequate mass felt like when you pressed the stone at various points in the heating cycle. Adequate mass felt like the stone at midpoint of the stove body, at the level of the upper chamber connection, maintaining warmth to the touch for at least 6 hours after the fire went out. If the midpoint stone was cool to the touch before 6 hours, the mass was insufficient. If it was warm at 8 hours, the mass was sufficient or more than sufficient. He had pressed the midpoint stone at the 3 in the afternoon measurement on November 6th, 8 hours after the fire, and it was warm. The mass was sufficient. The stone was doing what Schreiber had said it would do, which was hold the heat long after the fire was gone and give it back slowly. The way a person with a full stomach stays warm longer than a person who has not eaten. Schreiber had used that analogy in 1843, the fed person and the hungry person, and Joseph had remembered it because it was precise as well as vivid. The stone fed on heat from the fire and stayed warm on what it had fed. The unfed conventional fireplace had no reserves and went cold as soon as the fire went out. One piece of firewood, burned completely, fed the stone. The stone stayed warm for hours. The room stayed warm from the stone. This was the chain the title promised, and it was a chain that held because the physics held. And the physics held because Schreiber had understood them and had taught them to Joseph in 1843, and Joseph had built from them in Illinois in 1857. The knowledge was 14 years old when it arrived in the shed. The shed was cold when the knowledge arrived. The stone was cut and mortared and cured and fired and warm within the week. One piece of firewood, 1 week of building, 34 years of warmth. The 4 days of construction need to be described in physical sequence because the sequence contains the decisions that determined whether the stove would work or not. And several of those decisions were not obvious and were made by Joseph in ways that reflected specific knowledge unavailable to anyone who had not built contraflow stoves before. The first non-obvious decision was the mortar specification. Lime mortar, the standard for stone construction in 1857, was adequate for the exterior walls and the channels, but the firebox interior required a clay mortar. Because the firebox temperatures at full combustion exceeded the thermal tolerance of lime, causing the firebox joints to fail within the first winter and creating gaps that would allow combustion gases to bypass the channels and exit through the firebox walls rather than through the designed path. He used clay mortar, dry mixed, and rehydrated with water to the consistency Schreiber had specified. For all firebox interior joints, the clay mortar would harden under heat rather than failing. The silica particles in the clay fusing at firebox temperatures to produce a refractory bond that improved with use. He used lime mortar for all exterior joints and channel walls where temperatures would be lower. To mortar, the distinction was not mentioned in any American building manual he had read. It was in his hands from Schreiber's instruction. The second non-obvious decision was the channel cross-section. The descending channels had to be sized correctly to produce the required draft velocity. Too large and the draft would be insufficient to pull the gases all the way down, creating backflow at the channel base where cooler room air entered the exit manifold and disrupted the gas flow. Too small and the channels would restrict the gas flow excessively, creating pressure buildup in the upper chamber that would force combustion gases backward into the firebox and out through the door and into the room. Schreiber had specified 6 inches by 6 inches for the channel cross-section as the correct dimension for a stove of the mass and firebox volume. Joseph was building. Joseph cut and fitted the channel stones to maintain this dimension throughout the full height. Using his smallest chisels for the fitting work and checking each course with a straight rod of the correct dimension before mortaring the next course on top of it. The fitting took most of the building time. The gross stone laying was straightforward for an experienced stonemason, the same skill as laying any field stone wall. The fitting of channel stones to precise dimension at every course was the work that distinguished a contraflow stove that functioned from one that did not. He had seen one failed contraflow stove in Bavaria, built by a mason who had not maintained the channel consistency and whose channels had narrowed at one course due to an oversized stone that he had mortared in. Without fitting, the stone had to be removed and the entire upper half of the stove rebuilt. Joseph checked every channel stone with the rod before mortaring. He found 2 stones on the second day that required additional cutting and refitted them. He found 1 on the 3rd day. He found none on the 4th day, which was when the upper chamber and the exit manifold were completed and the stove was sealed. The curing day, November 5th, he spent on the shed's other deficiencies. He mixed a second batch of clay and pressed it into every remaining board joint he could find, working around the perimeter again more carefully than he had on the first pass, pressing the joints from both inside and outside where the boards were accessible from both sides. He pressed the floorboards for gaps and filled the 2 he found with clay tamped in from above. He checked the oilcloth window covering and found it sound. He also did something he had not planned but that the day of waiting provided time for. He mixed a thin clay slurry and painted the interior surface of all 4 shed walls with it, using a bundle of dry grass as a brush, working the slurry into the rough surface of the boards. The slurry dried in a few hours and sealed the surface against the fine, cold infiltration through the wood grain itself, which was not the same as the joint gaps, but was a real heat loss mechanism in poorly finished lumber. His father had shown him this technique for winterizing barns in Bavaria. The clay slurry as a surface sealant for rough board construction. It cost half a day, and the clay was in his materials stock. The shed after the slurry was noticeably more still inside. The absence of the small movements of air through the board grain producing a different quality of interior air. Still, rather than faintly moving. Still air. Dead air. The same principle that the straw in the wall cavities used, and that the straw wrap used, and that the frost trench used. Every technique for keeping a space warm reduced to the same underlying condition. Stop the air from moving. Moving air carries heat. Still air holds it. He had stopped the air in the shed with clay slurry and joint filling. He was about to hold the heat with the contraflow stove's masonry mass. The 2 improvements worked together. The sealed shell holding the warm air the stove produced, and the stove producing heat efficiently enough that the sealed shell could maintain it on 1 firing per day. The first fire, on November 6th, confirmed that both improvements were working. The shed was 58 degrees at 11 in the morning, and 51 degrees at 3 in the afternoon. Not because the stove alone produced those temperatures, but because the sealed shell retained them. A poorly sealed shed with the same stove would have been warmer near the stove and colder everywhere else, the heat moving toward the numerous infiltration points and escaping before it could distribute through the volume. The sealed shell and the stove together produced the result, the numbers recorded. Either alone would have been an improvement. Together they produced a shed that was warm all day, and warm enough through the night, on 2 firings that he slept without his coat from the first week of November onward. He had slept in his coat the 4 days of building. He had not complained to anyone about this. The mortar was laid, the fire was lit, the stone was warm. He slept without his coat. That was the sequence. 4 days plus 1. The rest was winter. The 2-day instruction course Joseph developed in the winters of 1858 and 1859 deserves detailed description because it represents a specific solution to the problem of transferring knowledge that cannot be fully conveyed in words. The contraflow principle could be described in words. He had described it to Vogel in 10 minutes. On the day Vogel first visited the shed, Vogel had understood the description well enough to grasp the concept. But understanding the concept and being able to build a functioning stove were not the same thing. And the gap between them was the gap that the 2-day course was designed to close. The first day was entirely without stone. He taught the gas path by drawing it and having the student redraw it until they could produce it correctly from memory. Not because the drawing was the knowledge, but because a student who could produce the gas path from memory, had internalized the direction of flow in both the ascending and descending channels, and a stonemason who had internalized the flow direction would notice when a channel design decision deviated from the flow requirement. The student who had only been shown the drawing once would not notice. He taught the channel geometry by having students cut sample stones to dimension with his chisels and check them with the rod before he would accept them. The purpose was not to produce correctly dimensioned stones, though it did produce them. The purpose was to give the students' hands the experience of what the rod measurement looked like when the stone was correctly cut, so that when they were building in conditions where the rod measurement confirmed adequacy, they had felt the adequacy before, rather than only hearing that it was required. Felt knowledge. His hands had it from Schreiber's Guildhall workshop in 1843. He could not give his hands to the students. He could give them comparable physical experience before they built alone for the first time. The second day was at a building site where a student's stove was under construction, a reduced-size version with a smaller firebox and shorter channels that would be functional in a small outbuilding and that would demonstrate the principle adequately without requiring the full material investment of a residence stove. He watched while the student laid the first 6 courses, correcting immediately when the channel stones were not fitted to dimension and making the student recut and refit before continuing. He corrected immediately rather than at the end of the session because a stove with one incorrect channel section required the removal of every stone above the error. If the student built 3 courses above an inadequate stone before being corrected, removing the error required removing 3 correct courses as well. If the student was corrected immediately, only the one stone needed to be recut. This was the economy of immediate correction. He had not been taught this explicitly. He had understood it by watching Schreiber correct him on the second stove they built together. When Schreiber had stopped him mid-course to refit a stone rather than waiting until the course was complete, Joseph had asked why, and Schreiber had explained, because the courses above this one build on this one, and if this one is wrong, the courses above it are wrong. And removing them costs you what the correction would have cost you, whether you correct now or later, plus what the removal costs additionally. Correct now. Remove nothing. Continue with a correct foundation. Joseph taught this to every student who took the 2-day course, not as a principle to be memorized, but as a practice to be demonstrated by the immediate correction he applied to their work. They learned it by experiencing it, which was the only way the lesson could be learned in a way that would be applied in solo construction when Joseph was not present. By 1862, 5 students from the 2-day course had built functioning contraflow stoves on their own claims without supervision. Joseph had inspected each stove before its first firing and had found one with a channel section requiring correction, which the student corrected before firing. The other 4 were correct as built, 4 out of 5 correct on first solo construction. He considered this acceptable. Schreiber had told him that 3 out of 4 was the expected outcome of competent instruction, and that the 1 in 4 who required correction was not a failure of instruction but the predictable consequence of individual variation in how hands translate knowledge into execution. Joseph's 4 out of 5 was slightly better than Schreiber's expectation, which gave students more opportunities to experience the feel of adequate fitting before they built alone. The stove spread. The fuel consumption differential spread with them, as every farmer who visited a neighbor's claim in winter and felt a warm room and small fire wanted to know what it cost to achieve it. The cost was Joseph's building rate or the 2-day instruction rate. both of which were recoverable in fuel savings within the first winter. The German immigrant networks in central Illinois moved the knowledge fastest, because the knowledge came from Bavaria, and the German immigrants had cultural proximity to Bavarian building traditions, even if they had not encountered contraflow stoves specifically. They trusted the principle faster than the English-speaking settlers did, and they asked more technically specific questions during the instruction and built more precisely during solo construction. The English-speaking settlers who came to the two-day course in 1860 and 1861 took longer to trust the downward draft mechanism, which seemed counterintuitive to people who had only ever seen smoke go up. Joseph had developed a specific demonstration for this group, which was to light a small fire in the test stove and show them the smoke entering the descending channels and traveling downward before they had accepted the principle intellectually. Seeing the smoke go down dissolved the doubt that the explanation alone could not dissolve. He showed the smoke to every skeptic. Every skeptic became a believer after seeing it. The knowledge spread. The stoves spread. The winter of 1862 in central Illinois was cold enough to be remembered for decades, and every family with a contraflow stove burned 1/8 of what their neighbors with conventional fireplaces burned. And every neighbor who ran short of fuel that winter came to ask why the stonemasons' neighbors were warm. Joseph told them why. He charged them the standard instruction rate to learn how. He built the ones who wanted him to build it and taught the ones who wanted to build it themselves, and charged fairly for both. Because fair charging was what sustained the work, and the work was what spread the knowledge, and the knowledge was what warmed the valley. The valley was warmer. The smoke went down in 9 stoves by 1860, and in more stoves by 1862, and in stoves he had not built and could not count by the time he died in 1891. He had brought the knowledge from Bavaria in his hands in 1854, and had held it for 3 years, while he built conventional fireplaces for other men's claims, and had applied it on the day he needed it, which was November 1st, 1857. Standing in a shed with his materials and his tools, and nowhere to sleep warm, the stone was cut, the smoke went down, the shed was warm. That was always where the story started. The story was still going in 1891. He did not need to see where it ended. There is one more element of the account that needs to be stated clearly, which is what Conrad Schreiber had said too. Joseph, in the winter of 1843, that had stayed with him for 14 years until the morning he needed it. It was not the contraflow principle. Joseph had learned the contraflow principle from Schreiber and from the 4 stoves they built together, and from the Guildhall stove that was the first one he worked on and that he had understood as a 27-year-old, thoroughly enough that he could have built one alone the following year if he had needed to. What Schreiber had said that stayed with him was something different. It was said on the last day of the Guildhall stove installation, when they had lit the first fire and watched the smoke descend and felt the stone warming at the channel level and measured the exit temperature and confirmed it was in the range that indicated the channels were extracting heat correctly. Schreiber had pressed the stone at the midpoint of the stove and held his palm there for a long time. Then he had said, "This knowledge is older than either of us. I learned it from my master, and he learned it from his. The Russians have it, the Finns have it. The Chinese have it in a different form. People who live in cold places find it eventually because cold places require it. We did not invent it. We inherited it," Joseph had said. Who invented it? Schreiber had said, someone who was cold enough, long enough, to ask the right question. I do not know who, and it was long enough ago that no one does. Joseph had thought about this occasionally in the 14 years between Bavaria and Illinois. Not because it was profound, but because it was precise. The knowledge was older than either of them. Someone had been cold enough and long enough to ask why the heat went up the chimney and what would happen if it did not. He had been cold in the shed on the morning of November 1st, 1857. He had not asked the question because it had been asked long before him, and he had been given the answer in 1843. He had only needed to remember it and to have the materials to act on it. The materials were in the shed. The knowledge was in his hands. The stone was on the claim. He had cut the stone and mortared the channels and built what someone cold enough and patient enough had worked out before his grandfather was born. And the stove had worked in Illinois in November of 1857 the same way it had worked in Russia and Finland and China and Bavaria. Because the physics of heat moving through stone did not change between continents or centuries. The smoke went down. The stone held the heat. The room was warm. He had pressed the stone at the midpoint on the afternoon of November 6th and felt the warmth that meant the heat was in the stone and not in the chimney. He had written in the account book, Schreiber was right. Schreiber had been right because the knowledge was right, and the knowledge had been right since before either of them had been born. It was right in Bavaria in 1843, and it was right in Illinois in 1857, and it was right in the 9 stoves operating in the central Illinois Valley by 1860, and in the stoves he had not built and could not count by the time he died. The knowledge did not belong to him. He had received it and held it and built from it and taught it at a fair rate to people who built from it in turn. The chain was longer than any of them. The smoke went down in all of them. The stone held the heat in all of them. One piece of firewood at a time. As long as the stone was cut correctly and the channels were fitted to dimension and the mortar was the right mortar for the right part of the stove, and the fire was given time to cure the mortar before the winter demanded the full heat. He had done it all correctly because Schreiber had taught him to do it correctly, and because he had paid attention, and because when November 1st, 1857, had left him with a shed and his tools and his materials, he had known what to build and had built it. The cold had not found him after November 6th. It had found the stone and stopped there. The stone had held everything the fire gave it and given it back to the room across the hours of the Illinois night. The long, cold, dark hours when the fire was out and the stone was warm and the room was warm from the stone. One fire. 6 to 8 hours. One piece of firewood. That was always enough. It was enough in Bavaria and enough in Illinois, and it would be enough wherever the stone was correctly cut and the channels were fitted to dimension and the mortar was allowed to cure before the first firing. He had known this since 1843. He had used it since 1857. He had taught it since 1858. The knowledge was older than all of it. The knowledge held. The Illinois State Historical Society holds Joseph Brower's account book in its collection of pioneer materials. The account book covers 1854 through 1889, 35 years of materials and labor records for the stonemason work he did across central Illinois, with the daily temperature and fuel entries for the shed winters running alongside the professional records as a parallel column. The November 6, 1857 entry is the one that the Historical Society's catalog notes specifically. First fire, 3 pieces oak, 4-inch diameter. Fire at 7, out at 11. Shed temperature at 11:58 degrees. At 3 in afternoon, 51 degrees. Stove still warm. No additional wood burned. Schreiber was right. The two sentences that end the entry, the measurement summary and the forward confirmation, are the entry that every account of Joseph Brouwer's work has returned to because they are the most compressed version of the entire story. The measurement first, because the measurement was the evidence. The confirmation second, because the confirmation was the relationship between the evidence and the knowledge that had been waiting 14 years to be tested. Schreiber was right. 3 words. 14 years of waiting. One November morning, in a shed in Illinois, with 3 pieces of oak and a stone stove with descending channels and the smoke going the wrong direction. Which was the right direction, which was down. The smoke went down because the physics required it, and because Joseph had built the channels that the physics required, and because Schreiber had taught him to build them in 1843, and because someone before Schreiber had worked out the physics in conditions cold enough to make the working out necessary, cold enough, patient enough, asking the right question about where the heat was going and what would happen if you made it go somewhere else first. Joseph had made the heat go somewhere else first. He had made it go into the stone. The stone had held it. The room had been warm from the stone for 34 years. The question was older than any of them. The answer was in the stone. The smoke went down. The stone held. The heat stayed. 1 piece of firewood. That was always the measure. 1 piece of firewood and the knowledge of where to put the channels. He had the channels. He had the knowledge. The knowledge held. The 9 stoves operating by 1860 and the unknown number operating by 1870. Each had one thing in common that the accounts of the period do not record explicitly, but that Joseph would have named immediately if asked. Each one had channels fitted to dimension. Each one had 2 mortar, clay at the firebox, and lime at the channels. Each one had a curing fire before the winter firing began. Each one had a first fire measurement written somewhere, in an account book or on a piece of paper, or remembered precisely by the person who lit it. Because the first fire measurement was the confirmation that the stove worked, and the confirmation was the thing you did not skip. You lit the fire. You waited. You pressed the stone at the midpoint. You measured the temperature at 11 and at 3. You wrote it down. Then you knew. Not because someone told you the stove would work. Because you had watched it work and written what you watched. The number was yours. The confirmation was yours. Joseph had his number from November 6, 1857. Every student who completed the 2-day course and built a solo stove had their number from their first firing. The numbers were different because the stoves were different sizes in different sheds of different volumes with different wood species and different November temperatures on different years. But the ratio was always in the same range. Shed temperature at 11 in the morning after a 7 o'clock fire of 3 pieces of oak, between 55 and 62 degrees, depending on the variables. Stove still warm at 3 in the afternoon. No additional wood burned. The range was consistent because the physics were consistent. Physics does not vary between claims. The stone cooled at the rate that stone cools. The room retained heat at the rate that sealed rooms retain it. And the relationship between the fuel input and the warmth output was determined by the contraflow principle and not by the individual variables of the specific installation. He had told his students this on the 2nd day of the instruction course. When they were building the reduced-size demonstration stove, the physics does not change between your claim and mine. What changes is how well you build the channels. Build them correctly, and the physics does the rest. Build them incorrectly, and no amount of wood will produce what the correct stove produces on one piece. Build them correctly. The physics does the rest. He had built them correctly in the shed in November 1857. The physics had done the rest for 34 years. The stone held. The smoke went down. One piece of firewood. That was the whole account. That was always the whole account.